Welcome to this lecture. This lecture is lecture 4 in the series of optics, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about spotting scopes. So we'll just start right off. There's basically two types of spotting scopes. There's a straight spotting scope, and then there's usually the angled view, and they're very different, but they're used essentially the same. If you already have a good set of binoculars that suit your purpose, whether they're 8 or 10 power or what have you, regardless of their size, one of the next instruments you want to consider is this good spotting scope. And the one attribute that this spotting scope should have is that it should have a longer reach than your binoculars. That is to say, if you put a coyote or a rabbit or some other wildlife at a given distance, you should be able to discern it at a longer distance with your spotting scope than with your binoculars. Again, it gets back to that concept that the binoculars to look for something and the spotting scope is to look at something. And this is the reason why you have a spotting scope. Now you can use a spotting scope, of course, to look and do a search, but generally it's the search that you're doing at an extended distance, at a distance beyond what your binoculars are capable of doing. And in that case, the spotting scope comes into its own. Now, as we said earlier, there's basically two kinds, the straight and the angle view. Some manufacturers even build a similar scope in both varieties, where you can buy the cert model that's straight and the same basic model in an angle view. And there's reasons to have both. And a lot of it tends to be opinion and even prejudice. I prefer the angle view, although I own a straight spotting scope as well. And they are quite different. For one, the angle view has an added element, the mirror or prism. There's different ways of doing it. And the straight does not have that. And of course, as we talked earlier, every time you add another optical element, whether it's a mirror or a piece of glass or what have you, you're burning up light and you're adding distortion. So this particular spotting scope in its straight view style optically is actually a better spotting scope. It will be brighter, a little bit brighter, have a little sharper image, and so on. However, there are limits and differences. One of the limits that I have found over the years with a straight spotting scope is actually trying to look up. And it seems like you do that more than down. And when you try to look up, especially say if you're going to use it for the night sky, you can see that this spotting scope can attain an angle like this and still be reasonable to look in. You have to lift it up a little bit. But you can cover the night sky a little better, or look up a steep hill. Whereas a straight scope, you would have to look way down into here, and it becomes difficult. The opposite does become true when you try to look down. However, you can see that you might have to stand up, or you can lower the tripod, and that is one way to cure that problem. Whereas the straight scope is actually a little better, it has a little more advantage looking down. Now there's another trick that I've used a number of different times that an angle view you can do that's kind of unique. Let's just say we had a maybe a herd of antelope off over in the distance or something like that. And what we can do with this is you can actually lower this a little bit. You can actually look into it like this and crank it. This particular scope actually has a built-in twist. And what you can do is you're looking at the animal that's off over here. And if they're out 200, 300, 400 yards, you're getting a magnificently close view of the animal. But at the same time, you're not putting a predatory stare at them. And a lot of times this will put animals at ease, especially animals that are used to being preyed upon, like an antelope or a deer or something. If they perceive you looking down and off this direction, their perception is that you're not paying attention to them. And if you're not paying attention to them, you're probably not a predator, or you're not in a condition that you're hunting them. So it's a way of, in a sense, removing you further from their awareness, reducing your presence, and at the same time extending your awareness, where you're actually very close to them and seeing them. But since they see you looking somewhat in a different direction and downward, which is a posture that's more akin to a grazing animal, a downward looking head, as opposed to the more upright posture of, say, a bobcat or a coyote. And these posturings make a difference, and of course that's the whole idea of optics, is to experience more wildlife and in a condition where the wildlife is at ease. And so you have in the spotting scope a means of getting more distance. Now, another problem, I guess you could call it, or difficulty that I have found over the years, is that an angle view is a much more difficult instrument to pack. You always have to protect this angled instrument, whereas this straight spotting scope tends to be easier and safer to pack. You can put it in a hard tube that's easy to find and build. So it's another difference between the straight and the angle view spotting scope. And it's just one of the many differences that you'll find. Typically this day and age, spotting scopes come in two sizes. They're either the 60 millimeter or the 80 millimeter. They're both good, and you need to always consider your particular use. My 60 millimeter spotting scope, I use it when I go hiking a lot. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's straight, it just carries better. It doesn't have the reach that this instrument has, but it does carry nice. And this instrument's mostly used from a vehicle, but I have hiked with it, and I do have a special case made up for it. But it has a lot of reach, and if you're going to go into a situation where you want a lot of reach, this is the better instrument. Now, the other thing about spotting scopes, as opposed to binoculars, is the time on glass. You'll never spend as much time really looking through a spotting scope as in comparison to a binocular, especially one on a tripod. The eye strain is always an issue, and since most spotting scopes come in a zoom package, that is usually something like 15 to 30, this one's a 20 to 60. You always want to start out with your spotting scope on the lowest magnification. That has the least eye strain and the brightest image. And there are times, especially early in the morning, late in the evening, when brightness accounts for more than magnification. And this is one of the tools that you can actually use to understand that, to to realize and play around with different magnifications and how that affects the image as far as distortion and lighting and so forth. But it's just one of the many tools that you'll want to have in your tool bag when you go into the desert and you want to learn the way of things. And with that, I hope you appreciated this lecture on the spotting scope. And the next lecture, number 5, will be on other attributes of both the spotting scope and the binocular. And with that, I thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.